All right, Job 1. Let's call this week's set of lessons Chipping Away, as Job is going to give us a chance to see the way in which the enemy or Satan seeks to chip away at a man's trust for God and ultimately his love for God, as we are introduced in this first chapter to Job, a man who seems to be deeply dedicated to God. And Satan's going to ask, why is that? Before we get there, though, the chapter is going to introduce Job as a man who has many oxen and donkeys and sheep and camels, but more importantly, it's going to introduce him as a man who is blameless and upright, who fears God and turns away from wrongdoing. And that's going to be really important because Satan is going to try to uproot Job's belief in what he thinks God believes about him. And that's a really twisted way of saying that when we believe that a person loves us, we can probably endure a whole lot more from them than we can if we believe that their motives are ill towards us. And that's the place where Satan is going to begin to chip away at Job, where after we see Job introduced, we're going to see the introduction of a conversation between God and Satan, where we're going to see that the sons of God are going to come before God, and it's going to say, and Satan also, at which point God's going to point out, have you noticed my servant Job, blameless and upright, fearing God and turning away from evil? And Satan is going to challenge him by saying, look, he does that because you spoil him, basically. You got a hedge of protection around him and you're blessing all that he has. Of course he'll serve you. He just wants what you're giving him. To which God is going to respond by giving Satan the ability to test Job by basically touching all that he has except for his person. And that's going to introduce the third part of the chapter, where Satan is going to do exactly that. First, bringing Job enemies in the form of the Sabaeans, who are going to raid and take all of his oxen and donkeys. After that, Satan is going to bring what is described as fire from heaven to consume all of his sheep. And then after that, he's going to bring more enemies in the form of the Chaldeans, who are going to split up into three groups as they take his camels off. And finally, trouble is going to come to Job's house in the form of a mighty wind that is going to topple the house in which all of his children are meeting together at a feast, which they were in the tradition of regularly holding. And so on a single day, Satan is going to bring wave after wave after wave of trouble, leaving him very few people to help him recover, understanding that the only people who are essentially left to him at this point are his wife and the 4 servants who are left to bring him word of all of the trouble that's brought him in these 4 sequential tragedies. But the chapter is going to conclude by saying, after all that, Job still neither sinned nor blamed God, describing his response in the famous words starting around verse 20 that read, "Then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head and fell on the ground and worshiped. And he said, 'Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord.'" But in spite of Job's resolve, of course, it is not over, because it is going to seem that the enemy has planted in all of Job's grief and despair a single seed that can be summed up in 2 words: from God. Because the word that's going to come back from Job's surviving servant, letting him know that his sheep have been consumed in fire of God, is going to actually be a misconception, because even though it's going to seem like it's fire of God, it's actually fire that's come from Satan. And through that one misconception, even though Job is strong now, the enemy is going to bring him through enough despair and eventually enough exhaustion that one misconception is going to allow him to chip away at Job's ability to not only trust God, but trust the people around him, as he brings Job into a place of isolation that allows the enemy to further chip away at his emotional well-being and eventually his will to live. And unfortunately, at Job's expense, we're going to get a chance to likewise see the ways in which the enemy often seeks to chip away at our emotional well-being and, unfortunately, sometimes our will to live as well.